we promised you Africa Day, and because it's Africa Day, we're going to have welcome comments all day. And so now we have welcoming comments from our provost, our interim provost. I just wanted to say a few words to introduce her. Her name is Dr. Professor Emily Mcdermott, and she came to UMass Boston in 1974 with a BA from Bryn Mawr College and a PhD in classics from Yale University. In her time at the university, she has taught over 35 different undergraduate and graduate courses, including Latin and Greek language and literature classes, classical civilization classes, core classes, so much. Let me run down. She has a very long bio here. Let me run down to some important milestones here at University of Massachusetts, Boston. She spent at least 10 of her more than 40 years on campus as chair of the classics department, 5 in the 1980s as assistant chancellor under our chancellor, Robert Corrigan. She spent 7 years, first as associate dean and then as interim dean of the Graduate Studies College, and then 3 as an interim dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and then as another 3 years as associate provost and dean of the faculty at UMass Boston, and she assumed the role, her current role as interim provost and vice chancellor of academic affairs in August 2017. Thank you so much, Provost Mcdermott, for addressing us, and please, I welcome you to provide comments to our Africa Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kiki, and welcome to all of you. That was a fascinating panel, and I'm very happy to have been able to listen to a significant portion of it. It is a little strange for me to welcome you in the middle of your afternoon, and I just want to explain a little bit how that came about. I was invited to welcome you at the beginning, and I wasn't able to come, so then they set me up to say goodbye to you at the end of the day, and after that was all set, the president's office, the system office, called me to a meeting downtown that I have to get to very shortly. And so I won't be here to say goodbye to you at the end, so somehow I'm in the middle. And I decided that that was, in a way, appropriate because I am the middle ground, as per your title, between the faculty panel and the student panel. And I feel a little bit like an interruption or a commercial break, but maybe I can view myself as a transition from one to the other and say how fascinating the topics you're dealing with are and how important they are to speak about. I was taken with Professor Nabarra's phrase about the reproduction of healing. I think that's something that can certainly be a lesson that needs to be learned in the African continent and perhaps on the North American continent as well. Perhaps every continent can use a dose of reproduction of healing at all times. At any rate, I don't want to take up much time here. I welcome you to UMass Boston. It's not as beautiful a day as if the sun were sparkling on the water out there behind you, but at least it's not snowing, which it often does in March. And so I welcome you. I hope you have a wonderful student panel. I trust you will be excited to hear the quality of the speeches by our homegrown students. And I hope you have a wonderful dinner and entertainment tonight. Thank you for having me.
Hello again. So, up next is our student roundtable panel on Afrophobia and Xenophobia in the U.S. Experience from the Frontline. So, please help me in welcoming our moderator, Gifty DeBordis Jackson, PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology here at UMass Boston.
Thank you, panelists. As they're settling down, there are a couple of things that I want to go over before we actually start a discussion. And one is each individual person will introduce him or herself once we do start. So give us a moment to get there. And also, we do invite comments and contribution as the discussion is ongoing. At the same time, you're welcome to write down questions that you have. We have a dedicated 15 minutes at the end to take questions and also to be able to respond to those questions. We have another graduate student, Benjamin. He's going to be holding a microphone going around, so if you have a contribution that you'd like to add to the discussion, again, just raise your hand, he will come to you, and you get a moment to speak. Okay, so I'm Gifty DeBordis Jackson. As Yah said, I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology, and my research focuses on African immigrants within the Boston area. So the topic of this roundtable is the legacy of colonialism and the emergence of Afrophobia. And with that being said, I'm going to ask Prince to start with the introduction.
Thank you, Gifty. So I am Prince Tomakele Mungembu, first-year doctoral student in global governance and human security. I am mostly interested in environmental issues like deforestation, climate change. So my research interest revolves around those. So I'm also interested in the issue of child soldiers, but also racism and also global environmental governance with a specific focus on Africa, if I might say.
Hi everyone, my name is Belle Diallo, and I'm a second-year PhD student in the Global Governance and Human Security program. And my research are on migration from West Africa to Europe.
Hi everyone, I'm Yingilai Farihana Brown. I am a PhD student at the McDermott Graduate School. My research focuses on coexistence, conflict resolution and management, and corporate social responsibility. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Usha Wongu. I'm a doctoral student at the School for Global Inclusion and Social Development. My research focuses on program design and implementation for underserved populations with a specific case study on persons living with disabilities in Nigeria.
Hi everyone. My name is Ellen Busolo Milimu. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Global Governance and Human Security program. Hi. Okay. My name is Ellen Busolo Milimu. I'm a second year at the Global Governance and Human Security program. My research interest is in sports. I specifically look at how sports is governed at the global level and how it impacts the individuals within states and across states.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Dennis Juuko, and I'm a student of Global Governance and Human Security in the McDermott School. And my interest is around transitional justice and victims of political violence, but I also have interests in migration and natural resources governance, but also the governance of security.
Thank you. So this is how this is going to work. I'm going to ask a question related to Afrophobia, and the panelists are going to start. And again, as the audience, if you have a contribution to make, you're welcome to do so, and Benjamin will come to you. Okay, so the very first question, if you're talking about Afrophobia, right? But we also know there is xenophobia, and that's what sometimes Afrophobia is considered or classified as. So for the panelists, what is Afrophobia, what is xenophobia, and how do we differentiate the two? And also, why is Afrophobia so important to distinguish?
Well, I can go with this one. I think. So, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Gifty. Great question. I mean, these two terms are often used interchangeably, and it is very important to make a difference between xenophobia and Afrophobia. Xenophobia is, generally speaking, the fear of the different, you know, or of the unknown, the fear of embracing the unknown. But you can refer to it, you can go back to like Greek language. It comes from Greek language, xenos, which is the stranger or the foreigner, and phobos, which is the fear. It is often used to describe the hatred and that, like I said, the fear of embracing people from other countries. But Afrophobia is a little bit specific in this case. Afrophobia is the fear, I would say, of the specific black person. Afrophobia is when we have this dislike of hatred of people from African descent. And when we are talking about African descent, we are not just talking about African as being African, but today Afrophobia can be related to when also talking to people of color, for instance, here in the United States. And this thing happens every single day. We see it, but we're not often aware of it, and we tend to use them as, or we tend to see them as being the same thing. Does that answer the question?
I was recently introduced to Afrophobia because I'm more, I know more about xenophobia. I heard about it happening in Africa. And that's something that I found interesting because when I look at part of my research, which is to talk about internal migration, and looking at the history of internal migration in pre-colonial Africa, but also in post-colonial Africa. Something that we notice is like before colonization, the African continent was really, there was a lot of movement. People migrated within Africa. And because there was already an economy that was linking Africa to the Middle East and Arab sultanates, so there were already some trade going on. And after colonization, there was like a boom of cities especially in West Africa. You have like big cities like Lagos, like Abuja, and also like Ivory Coast, because they were the center and metropolis where crops were, the raw materials were developed for like colonizers, I mean, to be exported to Europe or somewhere else. So when I look at this history in pre-colonial Africa and post-colonial Africa and how migration has shifted from being like forming a political economy in that region to actually being a labor migration, like attracting labor for a specific kind of work. And I wonder, given that the history shows us that this continent has been moving for a long time, like how did we come to xenophobia, hence Afrophobia? When did we start to fear the other African? When did we start to fear the other black person? So like I pose that question to all of you who have like a background in that, and I hope we get to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you for that question, Gifty, and thank you for the contribution, my fellow panelists. I am a little interested in something slightly different, but I also want to draw attention to the fact that there are different narratives about Afrophobia in the literature. So as much as we define it as the fear of people of African descent, there are still some narratives in the literature that actually define it as the fear of Africans against Africans, which is more specific within the continent of Africa. So I just want to acknowledge that out there. And then building on that, I want to talk about also how this plays out in experiential learning. We've heard about this in our last panel, and how it's expressed because I think it's the experiences of the people that lead to the situations we have on the ground in Africa. And so for me, I think we should not only look at the literature, but also look at the implementation. We should look at the factual things, the reality on ground, and how we connect that to the literature. That being said, I also want to bring up the concept of Ubuntu, because we've talked about also focusing on the positive part of things, and Ubuntu means as you are, I am because you are. We acknowledge the fact in Africa that I exist because we all exist. So therefore, you contribute to who I am. And that being said, we agree based on Ubuntu that we work together, we exist, we coexist naturally. And then that begs the question, so where does Afrophobia fall in? Does Ubuntu become Afrophobia because at some point we then fear Ubuntu? Or we feel it's unachievable? At what point, what actually do we believe in? It seems like there's a contradiction in this, in our thought pattern, in our belief. And I am grappling with that because these two concepts exist in reality, on the ground, and they are not, there is no struggle about them, but we also talk about Pan-Africanism, by the way, also an overarching part there. So it's great to have all these terms out there, but I think, because this is a roundtable, the discussion is interactive, I think we should also consider how these all interact. And the ambassador has said a bit about this, our panelists have said a bit about this, and I invite you from the audience to also discuss this with us. Thank you very much.
For me, I think the term Afrophobia, like I'm still learning about it, but when we started talking about that, what came to mind for me as my own personal experience, the fear of your fellow African, for example. So when I finished my master's degree, I'm from Nigeria. I went back to Nigeria to find work. I remember going from different offices to drop my curriculum, my CV, and to say, hey, I'm looking for a job, and I describe my expertise and what have you. And then I eventually got a job in an organization. And then you had this issue of your fellow Africans who are your bosses, trying to tell you, oh, you feel like you've come back with a foreign degree and you feel like you can come here and act as, act all knowing and all, And it makes it seem as if, oh, but no, that's not what I'm not trying to push that kind of narrative across. I'm just trying to, learn from you guys and then work with you guys and then to achieve the organizational goal at the end of the day. But there was always this back and forth fighting. And you go home every day and you think, oh, I'm in my country, I'm among my fellow people, and I'm feeling like, I'm back in my home country, and then my own country keeps pulling me backwards somehow, or keep making me feel like I'm not part of them anymore just because I've come back home with a foreign degree. So that when we talked about Afrophobia, that really came to mind as my own personal experience of, fear of my own fellow Africans and the tensions around that.
I would just talk about xenophobia in relation to sports in Africa, and I would say that some countries are more developed and organized in sports than others, and so we see a movement of athletes from, let's say, Kenya to South Africa. We had an athlete called Were who decided to migrate to South Africa and try and play in a team in South Africa, but it became so hard for him to play because it usually appears as a form of taking opportunity from those who are already in the country. So in terms of team sports and football being the popular sport in the continent, we see that most athletes prefer to play within their countries, even though it doesn't give you enough prestige. And when they try to migrate to another country, it's a struggle, it's tough. We also have women who have tried to migrate to West Africa, because West Africa has a better playing opportunity for women in football than in many other countries, although they never last. They always return back to their home countries. So in as much as it's never really explored in the sports arena, I would say that it exists just like in any other industry.
Yeah, thank you so much, moderator. For me, I look at Afrophobia as a question of identity. For instance, in Africa, and it pushes me to question the modern-day state system in Africa because it is giving us an identity, and therefore it is bringing out the differences that we have, given the differences in the identity. And so the modern-day state system, then it pushes me to question, for who does the modern-day state system work? What happened to the people that shared a common identity and a vision for that matter? And blending it with the question of Pan-Africanism. How did the different people on the continent, but also in the diaspora, come together to share into a common vision? And what happened after they had achieved independence with the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which is the present-day African Union? And then what happens in this common vision that we all share at the African Union? And I think Afrophobia as a challenge to Africa should be also situated in the leadership deficit. Because for us to have a critical conversation around the differences that are actually promoting Afrophobia on the continent, then we have to have leadership that is making that happen. What are the differences that we have? And this is not to say that actually differences are not healthy. Differences are healthy. But what we make out of them is what presents challenges. So we need to have a critical conversation on how we can live together without differences as a people who are sharing in a common vision of Africa. Then we have to transcend beyond Afrophobia to a common reality that the common challenges that we confront, but also a common Africa that we envision. Yeah.
If I may just jump in there. So I agree with you with the concept of a common vision, but I think also the idea of a common vision is subjective to the individual. So we have the common vision with respect to the countries, but we also have the common vision with respect to the individual and the citizen in that country, and how they experience that, which I think is something we heard about even in the last panel, and we've been hearing about also, even we've seen in the literature. So the concept is how, to me, I feel it's not just about having it all there, Pan-Africanism. Wow, this is great, this is wonderful. But operationalizing it. How do we operationalize it in a way that, in as much as we are all from the same continent and we all recognize that everybody is, by respect of evolution, is African, then how do we operationalize this in a way that we move from Afrophobia? Because I think it is the differences that we characterize in those countries that cause the conflicts that happen, that manifest on ground. So I don't know. In my opinion, it's not just about Pan-Africanism on a country scale, but also at the individual scale, and even in the families. You know, so that's my take on that.
Okay, thank you, panelists, for that introduction to different aspects of Afrophobia that you're interested in, that you want us to wrestle with. We are going to try and hit on some of them because we have very limited time. And the one I would like us to start with is the idea of pre-colonialism and whether there was an existence of Afrophobia within that time period, and also when we bring it back to post-colonialism, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s during migration within particular Western Africa, whether there were experiences of Afrophobia/Xenophobia.
Yeah, so something that I find in looking at this concept of xenophobia, because I think about the state system, which itself was not existent in pre-colonial Africa. So the concept itself of xenophobia was not, because xenophobia is based on citizenship. It's not on your ethnic background or tribal background, but like when you look at pre-colonial Africa, it was more about, you have nation states. And these nation states, of course, they had like some collusion, or maybe there was a lot of fight or wars, just like everywhere else. So I think, and that is still present even in countries where there is xenophobia, but even when they share the same citizenship, there are still some ethnic tension between the countries because of this idea of nation state, which is itself different from the idea of citizenship and xenophobia.
Just to piggyback on what you're saying, like nation states and borders, and Dennis was talking about identities, and I was thinking about social identity theory, for instance, you know, the in-group versus the out-group, in-group bias and favoritism, which is also can be a good way of looking at xenophobia, Afrophobia, and all that is happening, because when we have this bias towards ourselves, our group, it becomes kind of easy for us to just hurt the other because they don't mean anything to us. They're not from our group. And like we said at the beginning, that, and the other panelists also emphasized this, that it is Afrophobia or xenophobia at the basics of it is just the dislike or this hatred of the other. So when we, you know, look at ourselves as being the center of the world, then therefore we can hurt the other people. And so I just wanted to point that out, that if we also look at social identity theory, we can really find ways of like looking at Afrophobia and xenophobia.
Okay. So if we look particularly between Western Africa with Nigeria and Ghana, there was a period of Ghana Must Go in which the Nigerian government was let's say, was enforcing Ghanaian immigrants within Nigeria to go back to Ghana. What would you categorize an experience like that, right? And also if you can speak more to that history.
Thank you so much, Gifty. So, for the Ghana Must Go experience, it happened in the 80s. I believe it was 1983, and I believe it was President Shehu Shagari at the time passed a declaration requesting all immigrants without accurate documentation to leave Nigerian borders or be arrested at that time. It led to why it's fondly called Ghana Must Go is because it led to the deportation of over 1 million Ghanaians, which were largely the immigrants in Nigeria at that time. I would classify that as Afrophobia. And why would I say that? I would say that because it is, as you would say, the fear of the other, the fellow African, but also it was hinged on two different things. It was hinged on religious insecurity at that time because there was the Kanu riots which happened prior to that, and that was the basis in which the declaration was hinged on. But it was also hinged on the fact that the oil boom, which started in the 70s, and Nigeria had started at that time to gain revenue from taxes and exportation of oil. They were having some problems at that time. The country was having some problems, and there was some lack of financial resources. So I would say, back to my colleague's reference to labor and migration, I would say yes, it is Afrophobia, but I also acknowledge the fact that a lot of people migrate to other countries in Africa and even beyond Africa, largely because of the need of social economic, improvement of their lives. And so, in answering your question, I have one of my own. At one point, do we realize that, okay, great, immigration or migration is a natural phenomenon, but if it's a natural phenomenon, then why do we place a restriction of it? And at some point, it leads to this hatred that manifests as Afrophobia or xenophobia. But to answer your question, yes, I classify it as Afrophobia at that time in the 1980s.
And there are numerous examples today of xenophobia, Afrophobia, like we said at the beginning. This is very subtle, and sometimes when it happens, we don't really think of it as being Afrophobia at first. We don't think of it as being Afrophobia at first. Like in 2014 and 15, for instance, in Central Africa, especially between the two Congos, right, there was this police operation called Mcdermott, which is the slap of the big brother, right? So, and then how did that happen? Because the politicians and the media, right, started this narrative that there is the in group and the out group. These guys are not from here, therefore they have to get out of here, right? Because these guys are stealing our jobs. Pretty much the South African scenario. And we've seen that, and a lot of people that do conflict resolution would say that we need some changes in attitudes. That is a theory of change, for instance, or good governance to change these issues. But what happened is that these narratives, right, were taken by the population and used as a tool or as an assumption to hurt the other people. So we saw a lot of citizens from the DRC being, basically thrown out of the country, and by the same token, a lot of people died or women were raped and whatnot. But when this was happening, nobody thought about Afrophobia. Mm-hmm. People just thought, oh, they're outsiders, they are strangers, xenos. So they don't deserve anything in this country. So when those kind of things are happening, and not just Africans or, people from Bangladesh, and in the US here, people of color. So it might, and it will, or happen in different forms, but when this is happening, it is very important for us to keep an eye out and see and really identify what is really happening in order to effectively respond to it or tackle the issue of Afrophobia or Xenophobia.
Yeah, but while there is that story, actually, we are also beginning to see trends of a different story emerging on that topic. With regional integration, for instance, if I can cite the East African community, where in their charters we are seeing opening borders to the movement of labor, but also trade amongst those countries. However, there still exist some bottlenecks. Regional integration, marrying that with domestic policies for the different countries, it is a project that is still in the process. However, slowly by slowly, simple steps, small steps, we are getting there. So for the bottlenecks still exist. For instance, I was watching a video. Mo Ibrahim hosted Africa's richest businessman, Adenuga. And Adenuga was highlighting how difficult it is to do business. For instance, to export his cement from Nigeria to Benin, which is actually a country that is closer to Nigeria. And he was actually trying to highlight the fact that it's cheaper to import cement from China as opposed to transporting cement from Nigeria to Benin. So I think those bottlenecks still exist, and as I alluded to the question of leadership at first, that we need to really have transformational leadership that is going to allow for a critical reflection and discussion around the modern day state system. What are borders meaningful to Africa, or they are meaningless to Africa? And if so, what do we need to address that? The border issue is not something that is going to go away tomorrow, because it has formed identities that we cling on. But regional integration, I think, is a step that we are seeing that is beginning to deal with the question of Afrophobia. But as I mentioned before, simple steps, good results. Simple steps, good results. So if we can all share in that common vision, it is a question, the question of Afrophobia is a question that we can deal with.
So this is a follow-up for you, Dennis. When you say simple steps, what are you alluding to? Individuals taking simple steps? Are you talking about the government taking simple steps? Are you talking about leadership? Are you talking about policies, practices?
Yeah. Of course, leadership offers the vision of an Africa that we all want to see. And leadership, I'm seeing it in terms of a regional organization like in the African Union, but also sub-regional organizations like ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African Countries. We can say, I can say SADC, South African Development Corporation, but also the East African Community, and then CAMAC, which is a Central African regional bloc. So this is a conversation that is beginning to happen. For instance, East African community, copying from ECOWAS, where though East African community has gone full-blown with the opening of borders, irrespective of the current scaffold that exists between Rwanda and Uganda, with a closure that culminated into the closure of the border, but it's something not because of it is something that can be handled in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, and it's not an issue of xenophobia, but it's also an issue of a history that existed between the two countries, which takes us back to the leadership. Who has to play that leadership's role to ensure that these bottlenecks are addressed? I think as Africa, we have to share in the vision that the forefathers had, and then we agree on what are the right practical steps to take to address those bottlenecks. And I cite the question of leadership and governance because it's transformational leadership that will lead us there. I don't know whether I'm responding to the question, but I believe that is something that has to happen in Africa.
I would just like to make us remember that historically, even the leaders, because after Kwame Nkrumah, after Ghana got independence in 1958, we remember that he wanted a united Africa, but there were two camps. There were leaders who were for the unity of Africa, and there were those who were against the unity of Africa. So we can't necessarily just wait for our leaders to unite us if we don't mobilize and make them unite us, if that is the goal. So I just feel like we have to remember what was the reason of why we didn't unite in the first place. Some stated as the leaders were being greedy at the time, but we see effects right now. So I think we have to learn from our past and see how we can correct the future based on what was our past.
Well, I really agree with both of them, and I just want to go back on what Busolo just mentioned. Like, we cannot just rely on our leaders, and I was thinking about this, again, I like going back to conflict resolution because that's my background, like grassroots mobilization, like she said, which is a theory of change. And I would like to, if Professor Maria, who is here in the room, allow me to borrow that phrase, like the power of one through the power of many, for instance. Like, we can't really just rely on our leaders because it has been shown in Africa that most of the time, leaders don't really care about us. I mean, they do. It has been like they're like politics in Africa. There are some of them who do things for the sake of everybody, but I'm pretty sure that I don't agree with what my peers here would say about that. And my experience has been from the Congo just tells me that leaders won't do anything about that. So the power of one through the power of many, which is, let's look, go back to Wangari Maathai, and she would tell you probably more about that. What did she do in Kenya, right, to save the Kenyan forest, and what kind of work she's done? She is a model for our society. So we can also use and we can inspire from how people were fighting things in other parts of the world, even though it's not just related to race or gender or whatever, but what have people done in other spheres of life, and how can we apply that to into the fight that we're leading actually, and that's something that we can also do with Afrophobia. So grassroots mobilization, change in attitudes within the population, because when this theory shows that when people take the lead, when people go out there, they are strong, and when they are together, they can take down any system. So the leaders will have to comply and seek better ways to deal with issues that are at the root of this African not being united.
Not yet. We have Hannah, then Balkisa, and Uche, and then we start again. We still have about 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you to my fellow panelists again and all the contributions. And I just want to add to the concept of us coming together, the communities mobilizing to support. I think it should support the state's efforts. I think it should be that way because I am looking at this as human security. And why I say this is because irrespective of what the state tries to do what the regional organizations do, the operationalization of this affects the individual in the countries. And these individuals are the people that react, and the reactions create the conflict. And the conflict could escalate at state levels and cross borders, but initially it starts from one person, or from one group, or from one house, or from one family. And so I think that in as much as we are mobilizing, which I agree with, from the community level, we should recognize that we should develop policies and practices that would support what we want to see at the regional level. And we should be emphasizing a human security framework or operationalization of a framework that supports human security at that level. So there's a two-pronged approach to this. And so that it is sustainable. So everybody feels the impact of it. And I think that will go a long way. Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't know who's next. Okay.
I just want to come back to what we were talking about in the beginning, about people looking at others in a certain way and using a narrative that's the same used in RDC. I just read somewhere, somebody wrote that people love each other, they hate stereotypes. So I think in the case of Afrophobia, I think we have a big issue with stereotype, like actually building an image for a group, and that itself contributes to like the conflicts.
I do agree with the idea of mobilization and people coming together as a force to, sort of make the government do what they need to do. But we should also be mindful of the fact that there are issues with stifling freedom of speech in some of these states, and people fear for their lives for real. They want to come out for these protests, but we've seen some protests escalate into something else, and people dying on the streets for just coming out for a just cause. So I think we have to put that into context as well, as much as we want to keep on with the idea of mobilization, which is very, very helpful. And I just want to touch on the issue of poor governance and corruption, and how this might be playing out with Afrophobia as well. It's interesting to see how this relates, because when you have a government or a state that does not provide the enabling environment for its citizens to be able to realize their full potentials, at the end of the day, what you see is a lot of its citizens or people trying to voluntarily move away from that context by themselves into other contexts where or countries or states where they feel they have an enabling environment to help them realize their full potentials. And I say this because there are issues with how this is playing out with the whole brain drain issue. For example, you have issues of doctors wanting to just move out of the country, for example, Nigeria, to other countries where they feel they'll be more respected for their time, their jobs, and probably well paid and well taken care of. There are also issues with my research, for example, the issue with inclusive education in Nigeria, for example. We're having barriers with regards to limited number of teachers who have specialty in special needs education. And you sit down and you think, how is my government thinking about these issues on the ground? Like, how do we provide incentives that create opportunities for individuals to go to college and study about special needs education, and give them incentives as to when you graduate, you can get a job and you'll be well paid and compensated to be able to look after children with disabilities. Or for example, the doctors. What are the issues, what can we do to help you stay back in the country and really work for your country, for example? Like there was a situation recently, real life scenario, somebody, family member had an issue, and they took the person to the hospital, And the cardiologist, it was a heart issue, and the cardiologist was like, we need to operate on this artery, but there's no cardiologist in the country that's able to operate on this particular artery. In the entire country, for real. So they had to fly this person out, find a way to fly this person out. And I'm thinking of, this is ridiculous, and then every day we have more and more about young doctors graduating from school, doing the house jobs, and boom, the next thing they're out, So this is a situation where it's not about the government, like my colleagues have said. The people have to come in, but the government still has a key role in providing simple, basic amenities, for goodness sake. People don't even leave the country to make money out there, just for a simple life, for real. Like simple as part of 24-hour power supply, good water, and, safe environment, security. That is what people are even looking for outside of this context that don't seem enabling enough. I'll just pause on that.
Thank you, Uche. We are going to start taking questions and also comments now. So just raise your hand and Benjamin will come to you.
Thank you. My name is Nada Ali, Women's and Gender Studies. Thank you all for this conversation about Afrophobia. I think this is a very important topic, and I really am glad that several of you drew upon their research, actually, in engaging with this topic, this issue. And some of the solutions or ways out you suggest include like working collectively, right, to challenge Afrophobia. So I think what I hear is that we all agree that Afrophobia is negative, right, or xenophobia in general, right? But what other, ideas do you have about ways to address xenophobia and Afrophobia within the continent, and even beyond that? So some of the things I think of include the role of literature, for example. Just learning about the literature of certain, of other countries. The role of art, or even, and more importantly, the role of social movements that can actually form coalitions and work across countries. But do you have ideas in mind as well on ways to really address this challenge beyond the role of the African Union, beyond the role of the state? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nada. I would say education is the first point of call. I think that we, as Africans or individuals of African descent, have to first of all understand the issues that are on ground. We have first of all have to understand the differences. We should have conferences like this, which help with education, and we should, provide more opportunities to share scholarship and to have rigorous research on these topics, and not just have them, but to share them in schools. And I don't just think it should be in the universities. I think we can go to the high schools. We saw some middle school students here, right? This is something that affects them. We acknowledged that this issue is not unique to only Africa. It's just that there are narratives that supported being in Africa, but also it's representative here now, even as we talk, together in this meeting. So I think education is important. I think building on that, beyond education, then we should start thinking about how to build communities. And when I say communities, I am thinking about how to get these communities to speak in the aspect of coexistence. So we have an immigrant in an African country going through this challenge, and the problem is, with respect to, let's say, South Africa, or even in the case of Ghana Must Go, which is Nigeria and Ghana, it has to do with labor, it has to do with economics. Okay, so but you are afraid that this migrant is coming to take away your resources, but I think you are looking at it from a myopic point of view. You are assuming that your conception of that narrative is that this person moved from their country, came to my country, and is taking away my job opportunities. But what about the circumstances that surrounded that? Is that happening because of the social economic, the educational attainments of that individual? Is there some other issues that lead to that? So I think that it's not just about as you would say in doing a conflict tree, it's not just about the results of the conflict, but also the root causes of the conflict and what fuels those root causes. And I think we should look at those issues. And when we start looking at, which is where the research, it comes back to the research again. So it's a cyclical thing. You go education, build communities, education, build communities. Just that is my conception of it. And that's my take on that, my contribution. Thank you.
Okay. I would also take it from the point of education. I think, was it Professor Bibawah, when he was talking about his time in South Africa at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, that even in history, in the history that they were taking in South Africa, he didn't even hear about a history of frontline states that actually were central to the anti-apartheid struggles. I think we need to tease out the history that connects us together. For instance, how Africans united against apartheid, what motivated them to unite against apartheid, because African countries, a lot of African countries provided scholarships to South Africans who were in the struggle. They hosted them. They acted as frontline states like Tanzania, offering a training ground for the militia, for the military arm of the ANC, which is the Umkhonto weSizwe. And we learned of a history of Nigerians whose public servants, a certain percentage of their salary was taken away to support the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa. And I think this is the true history that needs to be taught even to the different generations, so that we know our history, but also recognize our African consciousness, so that we know how to deal with fellow Africans. That would be a first step to deal with the issue of Afrophobia, which is a practical one, calling our consciousness to what brings us together, to what we have in common, and what actually motivated us coming together to fight against a common challenge we had at a time, and how we can galvanize our energies as well to front a common future for Africa that transcends the Ugandanness, that transcends the South Africanness or the Kenyanness for this matter, but Africa as a continent, because we agree that we are one, we share a common history, and also we share a common vision. That's why actually we are coming together into the African Union, but also forming sub-regional organizations, because we believe that we have a journey that we need to move together. And so I think the education and the history that comes into that needs to speak to the realities, but not just treating history or teaching history in silos, just focusing on one part of the history and choosing to downplay the other.
I'm going to be a bit idealist and say that I believe in the power of sports. So if you were in the continent during the 2010 World Cup, you could sense that it was an African World Cup. Africa has only reached the quarterfinals of a World Cup, but that did not stop people from, dreaming and maybe hoping that maybe for the first time, since it was coming to the continent, maybe we could go far. What I'm planning to say here is Africa has the highest number of young people, percentage-wise globally, and this number is expected to rise until 2050. I would hope that our leaders would tap into this and maybe perhaps build an industry that is beyond just, like a continental competition based on sports that brings people together. When a country hosts a tournament, even if it's not as big as the World Cup, Kenya hosted the international athletics tournaments for the under-18 in 2017. And you could just feel it in the air that when an African country was competing, Kenyans are there to support the African country and not there to support, Kenya specifically. And there's something that happens when a competition happens, that if we can tap into this market the way Europe does, the way we go into pubs to watch Manchester United play, even if we have probably never been to Old Trafford in England, but the same way that we can power beyond a team like that, I think if we can organize this industry in a way that it builds the connectivity amongst people, it will be ideal to overcome Afrophobia.
So far, the conversation is how do we get people to that point, right? So how do we get people to the point where we can all congregate and tap into that passion, but rather than for sports, it's for the development of the continent as a whole, right?
One thing I would say is for us to move beyond the idea of sports as a social activity. That's important, but can we also invest in it as a business? Can we actually use it to develop the potential of the youth and the potential of the continent as it is, and not only for the athletes to be plucked out as resources for developed countries?
Wow. Yep.
About education. Basically, my question was about the educational system in Africa, and especially, on the secondary level, with kids. And, right now we're still learning the colonial system of education, where you know more about what's going on in the former colonizers than what has been happening, over the centuries in the African countries themselves. And I think that is very important, that there be a serious research into setting up a new type of educational curriculum, and try to make it as universal, African, Pan-African as possible. I just, it comes back to this whole thing about tribalism, and where people get all caught up in, well, my tribe is better than this one, or, they do that, and it's not, it's not something that my tribe would want to do. We have to, move beyond that.
We had one question over here, and that will be the last question.
Thank you. My name is Bisman. I'm from Rwanda. I would like to come back on economic integration, as Mr. Dennis mentioned that. I do agree, and as most of Africans, we all agree that if we can be more connected, then we can really achieve one of the goals of Pan-Africanism. But I do have just a question on, do we really need to emphasize on large organizations like African Union, or to focus more on sub-regional integration? Because I have been very pessimistic about sub-region integration, as we have seen how most of the sub-regional organization and integration just melted. Let's take an example of East Africa. I think before East Africa, we had some Great Lakes region integration, which was CEPGL. It just had a headquarters in Rwanda, in Gisenyi. Very beautiful white house. Now it became chocolate color because nobody even cleaned it. It just melted because of, the failed leaders. The same to Obekar, because they were the three countries, which was Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. They just formed the coalition just to protect the origin of Nile River. Then I don't know how the idea just turned around, and each country now is just claiming that it has the source of Nile. So that organization just melted. We had COMESA, we had SADC. Just my question, what can we really African, which one can we really focus? Is it this large organization like African Union, or we can really focus on sub-regional integration?
So there was a comment about the education aspect of it and making sure that the curriculum actually reflects the history of the African people and also the African diaspora. And then there's the regional questions, about 15 seconds.
I wanted to go back on what was said over there. That is true, and that is still happening today. I know more about Christopher Columbus or Napoleon than I know of Simon Kimbangu or Kimpanvita or these people that fought for Congolese independence, way before even independence, way before people like Patrice Lumumba, for instance, starts talking about independence. They were fighting. But we see that today, and that is reflecting also on how African people today are behaving, because whenever your history or your story is told by somebody else, it will never be into your favor. So I think we should also start, on an individual level. Most of the time when I'm home, I reject French, I reject English. I don't speak in English, I don't speak in French when I'm with my people, right? Because I have to embrace my Africanness. And then when I speak in Kikongo, people are like, oh man, you go to school, you're intellectual. I'm like, what means being intellectual? Speaking French? No. Then if that's the case, I'm not intellectual at all. So when we start from, I think that when we start on an individual level, knowledge is contagious. We can, spread it all around, and that can create in our societies this, people will be aware of what's going on, and they will see that we need some change. And if it starts from the bottom, change doesn't have to come from the top to the bottom. Like, this can be, like I said, grassroots. Like, it starts from us, and then ideas keep spreading. Maybe someday the leaders, top dogs, can take it and maybe change things. And it is very important that we change the colonial system that is still going on within education in Africa.
Thank you, panelists. That has been a really great conversation. If you have questions for the panelists, I ask that you find them on the floor and pose your questions to them. That is it for us.
Thank you.